Hello and welcome to ABA Live. I'm Michael Mayo, founding partner of the Advisory Board for the Arts. I'm joined today by my colleague Karen Freeman, our Executive Director of Research. Our session today is the 20th webinar that the Advisory Board for the Arts has hosted since the pandemic closed our world in March. For those of you who are not familiar with us, the Advisory Board for the Arts is a membership-based research organization dedicated to the pursuit of best practices and ideas to address the challenges that arts organizations face worldwide. You can learn more about us and see our research on our website. I invite you to take a look once the session is over. And of course, all of the webinars that we have hosted previously are available for viewing on the website. On the call today, we have a wide variety of members and guests from around the world. We are grateful to all of you for spending time with us. Thank you so much for that. So a bit of housekeeping before we begin. First, if you have a question at any time during the conversation, please type it into the chat box. You may send it to the entire group or direct it to Karen privately. Karen will keep track of all of those questions, and later in our discussion, we'll ask our guests to respond to as many of those questions as possible. At this point, I think it goes without saying that we are all very proficient Zoom users, so no need for an education. But to make our conversation feel a little more like a community, take a moment and put your name and organization into the chat box so that others can see who has joined us. I think you'll see some familiar names and be pleasantly surprised by the wide variety of organizations joining us. So in addition, as to better hear our guests, we have muted everybody's audio. And again, if you do have a question or comment at any time, please type it into the chat box. So let's get started. Our topic for our conversation today is government support for the arts, strategies for success for COVID and beyond. We'll explore not only the current state of government support, but steps that you can take today to increase that support for your organization. From a personal perspective, this is all a bit nostalgic for me. My first job in the performing arts was in early 1981 as Director of Government Affairs for the American Symphony Orchestra League. I know I'm dating myself on two counts there. First, telling you how old I am, and secondly, referring it to the American Symphony Orchestra League, which of course it was before it became the League of American Orchestras. I started in January, shortly after President Reagan was inaugurated, and just as David Stockman, who was then the head of Office of Management and Budget, announced the administration's attempt to eliminate the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Organizations representing all arts organizations and museums banded together to take our message to Capitol Hill on what became the first Arts Advocacy Day. Today, that work and activity continues, now led by Americans for the Arts. Today, we are happy to welcome Bob Lynch, the President and CEO of Americans for the Arts, to talk about what's changed, what hasn't, and more importantly, what you can do about it. So Bob, welcome and thank you for joining us. Please tell us a little something about yourself and the work today of Americans for the Arts.
Great. Well, wonderful to be here with you. And the thing about me is that I've been doing this kind of work for about 45 years, 35 years as the CEO of Americans for the Arts, and 10 years running an organization in Massachusetts that was doing similar kind of work called the Arts Extension Service. And my own arts background came out of the poetry side of things, the wood carving side of things, and the rock and roll side of things. So all of those are still passions and interests, but all of the arts is my main passion for all of the people. One of the things that's interesting is I came in 1985, so just a few years after you left, Michael, and 35 years ago, 1985, and was at the tail end of the battle with the Reagan administration, although I worked with that administration for a couple of years. But one of the things that's interesting, just as an illustration of things changing, I was doing a presentation in Aspen a number of years back, and in my audience was David Stockman, who you mentioned. And in our conversation, he apologized for that opposition to funding the NEA, that devastating opposition that cost 10% of the budget ultimately, apologized and said, in retrospect, it was not the right decision. So isn't it interesting how that kind of stuff changes? Let me say a word then about Americans for the Arts. And I noticed, I had said to Michael, anticipating some questions, pulled together a few slides. And so I have one about Americans for the Arts. And I noticed a number of old friends on the call, just as names have come up, Martin Kagan being one that's looking at me right now. So a lot of folks have been along the journey of Americans for the Arts in one way or another, but we were founded in 1960 with the same vision that we have today. All of the arts, from craft to symphony and everything in between, all of the arts in the lives of all of the people, whether that's urban or rural, every ethnicity, every income area, all the arts, all the people. And way back in 1960, when we were known as the Associated Arts Councils of America, we led the effort to actually create the National Endowment for the Arts, led the advocacy effort, which was created in 1965, along with all of the state arts agencies. There were only 4 when we came into being, and all of the local arts agencies. There were just 100 when we were founded, and now there's 5,000. And so Americans for the Arts, the main thing to know is that over the years, we've done 6 mergers to create the organization that we are today, and that it is actually several organizations. The main one is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, tax exempt, with 5,000 arts councils in every city in the nation, all the state arts agencies, all the state advocacy organizations, and probably another 5,000 individuals and organizations who care about that community arts development vision. And so that's Americans for the Arts. But underneath that, you see that we are also the Americans for the Arts Action Fund, a 501c4 organization that is political. It's one of the few in the arts. And a third entity attached to that is the Americans for the Arts Action Fund PAC, Political Action Committee, the only arts action committee national. And that allows us to gather up money and give it out to political candidates and to take positions on electoral work, actual candidates. And you see behind me on this screen, one of our campaigns is to get out the arts vote, because we know that it's a very powerful vote. Millions of, literally 150 million people in America, arts enthusiasts and interested, who care, and their vote is very powerful, and getting out the vote is a big part of what we're doing. And this poster done by the artist Shepard Ferry is part of the campaign that we're doing right now. We have 450,000, it says 400, citizen activist members. They join for free. They donate to the PAC if they want to, and that's the clout that we use to advance Americans for the Arts. So to advance the arts in America through the Americans for the Arts Action Fund.
Sounds like you've come a long way since those early days of founding and since you began the organization. I'd love to start with a bit of perspective. What does arts funding look like over time at both the federal level and the state and local level? What's been the policy of the current administration? What are you seeing in terms of arts funding historically and today?
So it's really interesting. I study it all the time because we work on the advocacy side of it, and anticipating, because we talked about this, that question, I have another slide that shows some graphs of where money for the arts has been going over the last some 20 years. And the main thing to know is that you have 3 levels of government there, and they're all quite different. The bottom level is federal money. Now, one of the things that, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but the system in America is unlike, in the United States of America, is unlike any other country in the world. We are largely not a country where art is funded by government, but funding for art is incentivized by government money. That means the concept is a little bit of government money leverages the bigger money, which is private sector giving or earned income. And so at the bottom, you see that the National Endowment for the Arts since 1999 has had a pretty steady amount of money, a blip up there. If you went earlier, you would see a blip down in the Reagan administration that you already talked about, and a big dip, a 40% cut during the time of Newt Gingrich and Senator Jesse Helms, arch conservatives who used blasphemy and pornography attacks on the arts as a way to make change. And they did dramatically, 40% cut. But essentially, it has been going up slightly to get back to that level. And in fact, in 2020, it went to 165. And that's the federal level. And I'll come back to that. At the state level and at the federal level, you see at the local level, you see those graphs look similar. They're one is bigger at the local level, but they're similar. That's because they follow the economy largely. If you put a graph up of the United States economy, it would be the same picture. So when the economy is good, money to the arts, taxes are up, money to the arts through the government at the state and local level goes up. But one difference there is that local is higher than it has been at any other point on that chart, and state is down lower than it was way back in 2001. Why is that? Well, one of the reasons is that obviously economics and politics at the state level, but at the local level, community development and the use of the arts as a community development tool has been something very much understood by mayors and city councils and county commissions. And so a lot more money has come in and will continue to come in using the arts as a partner in the building block of American community. So those three things are there. They represent, I'll say one more thing. There's more money in each of these areas. My estimate for local is about $3 billion a year of local government money, but we use a sample group of about the 100 big ones, the big local arts agencies in the country, out of the 5,000 total to come up with this figure, the 860 billion. But that money for all of government is about 9% of the income of arts organizations in America, 9%. 31% of the income comes from private sector. And so a really big tool in the American US portfolio is charitable giving law, which we spend a lot of time on allowing more donations to come. And then the most of the money, 60% of the in general pot of money coming to nonprofit arts organizations in America comes from things that the arts organizations sell, earned income, ticket sales, bookshops, things like that.
Which of course, in the pandemic, unfortunately, that avenue is now closed to us. So let's focus on the pandemic. During this time, certainly since February, March, arts organizations have turned to, naturally, as you suggest, private donors, the greatest source, and foundations, many of whom have created special funding programs both nationally and locally. In Europe, the support for the arts, as you note, has been dramatic consistently, but certainly so in the time of the pandemic. In England, the Arts Council of England provided a 1.5 billion, that's billion, not million, pound program package for arts organizations. In Italy, there are 245 million euro that have been allocated for arts groups. In Spain, 76 million euro, and Canada has set aside 500 million Canadian dollars. What's happening here from a government perspective in the US in terms of the federal level, but also state and local level in terms of programs to support arts groups during the pandemic? And by the way, what, in addition to what's been done, what is left unfinished that still needs attention? So
one thing I'd like to do is just to, before we jump into that, take a look at what we mean by the arts and what we mean by the arts economy, because it's, again, different in the United States than it is throughout the world. In most places throughout the world, there is not a distinction between the nonprofit arts and the for-profit arts. They're blurred together. Here, we have a very, very distinct set of tax laws. So there's a figure that many people have probably heard in the United States that our federal government has come up with when they look and they do the count of what's the total footprint of the arts in our country. And I use this figure whenever I'm trying to talk about how big our industry is in my lobbying work. and that figure is $877 billion. An $877 billion economic footprint is what our Department of Commerce Bureau of Economic Analysis says the arts are in America. But that is everything from the nonprofit arts that we were just talking about to the for-profit arts like Broadway and Hollywood and the local music store, going up into arts as part of other industries like publishing and so on. You put that all together, $877 billion. If you looked only at the nonprofit organizations, the ones with 501c3 status, our own Americans for the Arts, every 4-year study called Arts and Economic Prosperity pegs it at $63.8 billion. Okay, this is really important. 63.8 billion is a lot smaller than 877 billion. So when I want to talk about what we need, I use the 63.8 billion. When I talk about how important it is, I use the 877 billion. Now, with that, we now come to the pandemic help. So if you go to the next slide, I brought 2 slides on the pandemic, this one shows actually a lot more help than anybody really realizes, because usually if you're looking at the arts in America, you might look at how much did the National Endowment for the Arts, the smallest entity out there, get for recovery. And that was $75 million that they got. But it was part of a much bigger chunk of help that came from things like the Small Business Administration PPP loans or insurance help, pandemic insurance help, a number of different areas that collectively, you can see right there, for just the nonprofits was a substantial 1.8 billion. And if you go to that larger economy that I was just talking about that has Broadway in it and so on, it's 13.7 billion. Compares pretty well to some of the European figures that you were using before. So again, it depends, how you look at it. And you see there's a lot of loans that were given out there. Now, if you go down to nonprofit, you see 9,917 loans. We peg the nonprofit industry with other colleague research organizations at about, the nonprofit arts at about 120,000 organizations. So roughly, 9% or so of them got some money, and this is still going on. And then when you go up into the for-profit world, you see that it's a much larger number of organizations. I think there's a big change going on in America right now with how we look at the arts, how the different art areas are collaborating, how funding sources, federal, state, and local, are looking at funding the arts, because that $877 billion figure is big business. It's bigger than tourism itself. And that is probably the single most important fact that is swaying public policy and support in our country. I think there are some other slides that might be right here after this one. That sort of show that the breadth of the support that is happening in the country. Not enough. Far, far away from enough. But, you know about the National Endowment for the Arts figure that I mentioned, but not necessarily about Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP loans, which are not loans, they're forgivable. So it's actually a grant. The emergency injury disaster loans, smaller. And at the bottom there, things like community development block grants, which is chunks of money going to cities that if you are a savvy city, you are able to negotiate a piece of it for the arts in regular times, and particularly now in these COVID times. So there are a lot of things at work, and we're out there pushing for all of them all the time.
So given this, Bob, what should arts organizations be doing today to ensure special pandemic funding, to ensure that the base level of support federally and locally is still flowing once the doors reopen and we'll be able to begin to admit our patrons again? What should we be doing today and going forward? What are there still opportunities for support that are are languishing for lack of attention? What needs to be done?
So, you know, I came into this work thinking only about the art side of it. And as I got more involved in trying to help organizations get more resources over the years, I became very, very much involved with the political side. And of course, now Americans for the Arts Action Fund is entirely political, and the PAC is extremely political. We give out about $250,000 per election cycle right now. What I think at the top of the list is political involvement. It doesn't have to be very much, but the arts are very, very powerful, but it's meaningless unless people are actually involved, making the calls, being involved in voicing their opinion to their legislators. You know, at the local level, for example, a city council person thinks that if they receive 10 calls on the subject, they've had a landslide of opinion. So, you know, with our great theatrical skills and the ability to perform, boy, we could make a lot of noise, a lot more noise than 10 calls, and make a difference. And I see it again and again. That kind of political will and political clout will be the difference between two cities of the same size, one with a very, very robust arts budget and one with not. So that's one thing. And again,
can you give an example or two of somebody that you know who's done this really effectively that others could learn from?
Sure. The city of Miami, Miami-Dade County would be a great example. Miami-Dade County is, you know, one of the top 10 size cities in America, but it is funded in the arts way above its weight at probably over $100 million. Now, remember, the National Endowment for the Arts budget is $165 million. This one city, which is smaller than the city of New York, that's over $200 million, that one city. But in Miami, in Miami-Dade County, they have really, really built the concept of the arts as core to the future health of the city. Things that are really being hurt right now, like Art Basel Miami, they came to Miami because an atmosphere was created that was supportive for that kind of work. And then so many nonprofit organizations and others benefit from a big arts audience being there. But they, through a variety of programs, are over $100 million in funding for the arts. So that would be one example. City of San Francisco traditionally has been another, with two pots of money, somewhere over $60 million last time I checked. And you know, that's critical. Now, another city that I love, because I'm from Massachusetts and I'm in the city of Boston, and I'm on Cape Cod right now, quarantining here. But the amount of money that it actually gives out in a budget is about $1 million. That's a big difference from the 100 million of Miami. Now, Boston, as an example, has traditionally had a much different funding model, lots of private money, lots of quiet private money. But if we're just talking about public and we're just talking about money going out, that's a stark difference. One of the things that Mayor Marty Walsh in Boston, however, has implemented is trying to change that situation, getting art leaders and artists themselves involved in the different departments of city government, you know, Department of Public Works, the police. And so that's another strategy besides pure money that might lead to money. So there's lots of different things going out there to move the public money dime.
Now, none of these things obviously have happened by accident or serendipity. There's clearly been a lot of hard work behind the scenes. How have arts organizations banded together, working with you to help move the needle here?
Well, in a couple of ways. One is it's the individuals from organization joining something like the Action Fund. When you get up to 450,000 people, you know, that we can contact through email, we can have 100,000 letters of emails on a legislator's desk overnight when there's something that we're calling on them to do. So that's one thing. The second thing is that in almost every state in the country, there is a state statewide arts advocacy organization, a state arts advocacy organization, and we've pulled them together into the State Arts Advocacy Network. They share strategies. They work largely on getting those state dollars flowing, and we help them by working with the National Lieutenant Governors Association, National Governors Association, National Conference of State Legislators, the decision makers. They were on my original chart as a group of about 1,000 people that we work with. And by being in front of them and sharing the arts value message, we hope with us doing that nationally and the state organizations doing it from the state level, it will pop out bigger arts budgets at the state level. And there are many examples at the local level like that as well. And one thing that we're working on right now is we're putting forward a plan to get creative workers back to work, like the old WPA under Roosevelt, or CETA, which was launched under Nixon. There's a Democrat and a Republican. And we have we have 1,600 other organizations and some individuals as well signed on to say that our plan to get creative workers back to work, federal, state, local, is a good plan, and they support it. And then that clout then allows the creation of dialogue and eventually a vote.
Great. You know, when we talked yesterday, you mentioned, and you've talked about some of the other forms of funding in areas where, besides the NEA or a state arts agency, that arts groups could go to. And one of the ones you mentioned were those dealing with social impact. Can you talk a little bit about that and opportunities that presents for arts groups? Sure.
So the idea, I think we started exploring this idea a long time ago when we collectively, let's say the local arts agencies, were looking at the needs of the community. They're embedded in community, and they all started off looking, back in the late 40s at getting art into the lives of the people and supporting art organizations, the symphony, the theater, groups like that. But since they were embedded in community, but many of them in government, they started to see other areas of need, education being maybe the first one, so arts education, and then art in public places being a second one. And slowly, as they started to work together with government and with the private sector and with these arts organizations, you started to see what we have put together as a pinwheel called the Arts and Social Impact Explorer that looks at every aspect of community, whether it is the economic aspect, whether it's the charity aspect and the needs of health or homelessness, the military, and many, many other community advancement components, and found that there were arts programs in every one of those areas. And if there weren't, there should be, because they were great models in other communities. And so what started to happen is that other aspects of government, let's say the Senior Citizens Department, Elderly Services Department, would start to put money into the arts. And the foundation world, which the old model, back when you were at the NEA, people would go around and, big pocket staffers at foundations would hand out money to arts organizations just for being an arts organization. Not today. Today it is about what is that arts organization doing in a broader way to advance society and community. And so many of the money packages that are coming, whether it's government or private, are about arts, what I call arts and something else. Arts and community change, arts and a better life for the elderly, arts and the healing of the military, wounded warriors, and so on. Which is today, for example, one of the very biggest programs of the National Endowment for the Arts, and we have a very big footprint in that as well. The funding of art programs to help wounded soldiers through art therapy come back physically and mentally. So this is something that is only getting more of an emphasis and stronger. Whether we like it or not is irrelevant. It is what's happening. And I happen to like it.
Yeah. So I think the question that is most likely on everybody's mind is Gee whiz, there's a presidential election in less than 3 weeks. Um, Arts support is not a topic that comes up at presidential or even vice presidential debates. And yet there are clearly people who care passionately about this in both parties. So from where you sit, what do you think happens after November 3rd, or at least after January 20th? What can we expect if President Trump is reelected? What can we expect if the Biden-Harris ticket is elected? What do you see post January 20th for based on the election?
So I'll go back to the slide that is up behind me, the Arts Vote slide. So we've been working for a long time, many years, on presidential campaigns for the last 20 years, actually, and going into all presidential candidates as they run, trying to get statements and survey them about their arts positions. And in fact, this year, what we did even more. We worked with the artist Ben Folds to do podcast interviews with as many of the presidential candidates as we could, starting with Pete Buttigieg was the first one we did. He came to our office and we were able to get him on record, and got most of the Democratic candidates one way or another, and had material from earlier, the last campaign from Donald Trump. Didn't get an answer this time from him, but he has given his answer in his legislation over the last 4 years, which also is an interesting thing right now. So when you look at that, we know simply from the work that we've done on the Democratic side, and we were able to work with the party to, we offered to both parties to get arts planks into the party platform. And there is a plank in the Democratic platform, not one in the Republican platform. And the one in the Democratic platform calls for more money for the agencies, NEA, NEH. It calls for more money for arts education. It calls for using partnership of state and local government to advance the arts. It calls for building bridges, using the arts in a community development kind of a way in community, and doing the same thing internationally. Now, it does it in very general language, not specific calls with dollar amounts, but it's there. And candidate Vice President Trump, Vice President Biden, has also talked about things like the importance of art in his life, overcoming a disability, overcoming his stutter through poetry. Kamala Harris and Joe Biden both have an A+ record in voting for the arts. We at Americans for the Arts for 20 years have tracked every vote of every member of Congress, and you can see it on our website, and A+ is as good as you can get. So we know what's going to come from that side. Now, on the other side, on the Trump side, it's interesting. President Trump starts off in a process of how law is created in our country as the first person to put a mark out through the Office of Management Budget. Every year, the president puts out a budget. The budget has called for zero funding for all the federal cultural agencies, 4 years in a row. So that's the policy statement. Now, what's interesting about our policy in America is that it starts off with the president, and then it goes to the House of Representatives, and then it goes to the Senate, and then, there is a slide here that you can take a look at. And then it goes after they all weigh in to a conference meeting of the House and the Senate and the White House, and then the president gets to sign again. So the starting point of President Trump was zero, NEA, zero, NEH, zero for all of the agencies that give money out in the United States, and either holding the same or increasing the budgets of the ones that are in Washington, D.C., like Smithsonian or the National Gallery or things like that. So, I mean, it's sort of a strange policy, but that's what it is. Anything that was given out was eliminated. Everything that was there stayed. That was what started off. Now, because the House was very, very strong with our Democratic Nancy Pelosi, and we had some good Republican friends in the Senate, when it came out of conference, there were increases each year for the last 4 years for those same entities that were zeroed out. And the president signed that. So I read something yesterday where a member of the administration was claiming that President Trump was one of the greatest arts presidents because he had signed the bill after it was done. So, you know, you can look at it however you want, but that's the track record. I think that from everything I'm hearing, and I've been doing some volunteer work on this as well, from everything I'm hearing, that the Biden-Harris administration will be very interested and supportive of an expanded arts role in America. And I don't know what the result would be with a Trump presidency.
So I'm curious to ask the question I've always, I guess I have always heard during my tenure, both as an arts advocate as well as working. There's an old saw that says Democrats talk about supporting the arts, but Republicans actually do support the arts. And certainly the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities, as you know, were created during the Nixon administration, although more with support from Nixon staffers, I think, than the president himself. But given what you've said about the current administration and the Biden-Harris ticket, that is maybe not the case, or is there some truth to that?
I don't think there's any truth to that, but there are echoes of truth. Let me put it like everything, you know. But I'll just point out that things have changed. When I first heard that was a long time ago, half a century ago. Half a century ago, you had what were known as Rockefeller Republicans. And Rockefeller Republicans were very, very progressive. For example, our organization was incubated in the Rockefeller Brothers Fund in 1960. And I said we did 6 mergers. One of them was the Business Committee for the Arts that was established by David Rockefeller. And we still have a thing called the David Rockefeller Lecture on Private Policy. We have the Nancy Hanks Lecture on Public Policy. So there was more bipartisan interest in the arts back then. Now, just one thing I'll just say about the creation of the National Endowment for the Arts. It actually was incubated in the Kennedy administration, and it was brought into life in the Johnson administration, so 2 Democratic administrations. But under Nixon, it had its biggest growth, percentage-wise, ever. So Nixon also was one of those Republicans that you're talking about. But the party has changed a lot in its interests into the current Republican Party, which I think is far less supportive. I mean, this is on the record, far less supportive, and you can look at our voting records of money for public support for the arts. They are supportive of the concept of more, they have been at various times, charitable giving incentives to get private sector flowing. I also think that sometimes people will look at a track record, like the Trump track record, and they'll count what happened at the end as evidence, as opposed to how we got there. And so, you know, when some great leaders of one party were in one branch of government, great leaders of the other party were in the other branch. And only a few times were they all consistently holding every area. We have not had a radical shift, except for the 40% cut in federal funding when Newt Gingrich controlled, as a Republican, the Congress of the United States. It's been pretty consistent with, at the end of the game, Republican and Democratic support.
We have a question that comes from the chat box, and it's an area of support that I think you've alluded to, but not actually talked about specifically. And she asks, if there's been a trend either way regarding tax apportionments in metro areas. And she mentioned specifically Denver as an example. And is that dependent on political leadership in that area, arts leadership? And, I mean, it's the idea of tax districts and tax over line items is not one you've talked about. How does that fit into the picture of support for the arts and areas that arts organizations could pursue?
So that's the fascinating area. When I was showing the graph of federal, state, and local funding, and I showed the larger graph at the local level. Okay, but then I said that that's only showing under $1 billion. It's probably well over $3 billion. That's exactly because of what this particular questioner is asking about. The extra kinds of dollars that are coming in because of creative local initiatives of one kind or another. Out there are things ranging from hotel motel tax, which is one of the big funding entities, where a tax on a hotel occupancy goes to the arts. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of those all across the country, and they're all hurting right now because nobody's going to hotels. But there's also, in addition to that, there's golf tax that is in one community. There used to be a real estate transfer tax in Aspen. There's a cigarette tax in Cleveland that's very powerful. There's another entity in Minnesota that combines hunters and arts folks together for a small tax that then it gives a lot of money to the arts. Denver is a great example because Denver, I think what the questioner is asking about is a thing that is called the Arts and Science District. It's 7 counties that have banded together and lobbied to get a piece of a penny of sales tax dedicated to the arts. And that has added up to something like $50 million a year that comes. And however, they have to fight for it. It comes up for a vote every number of years. And it actually was, I think, defeated the first time many years ago, 30 years ago, when they went to get it. And they banded together, and they found that there was strength in bringing the science community and the arts community and the zoos together to fight together for this. They, I think, determined that they couldn't get it on their own. And so that's a very, very lucrative example that pumps that city, Denver, way up in the rankings of money that would come from different communities. However, there is no pattern. The pattern is when you have organized citizens with an idea, then you have a success. But if you don't have that, you don't have that success. And we do training all the time at Americans for the Arts to different groups on the different things that have worked. But there's nothing like individual or public will to make it happen. But if somebody wants it to happen and is willing to organize, there's lots of models out there that shows that success.
So I want to go back to something you said at the outset. You talked a little bit about the research, and you made reference to the economic impact work that Americans for the Arts has done for years. Talk a little bit about the research that you're doing, how that can help arts organizations become effective advocates for themselves and for their colleagues, but also specifically, I know you've been doing a lot of research on the impact of COVID. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that can help organizations, how that's a resource that can help organizations?
Sure. I'm not sure if we have some slides on this one. I know I brought some on the COVID, but that's okay. Let me just, I'll come to COVID secondly, and I'll start with just in general. If you're looking at any legislative body, it is a pie chart. If you think about that, it's a pie chart of interest. And if you take the United States Congress, they're all interested in government and a budget, but some are interested more in children's issues, some are interested more in elderly, some are interested in jobs and economics, and so on, going right around that community impact chart that I put up before. Well, at the top of the list of every entity of government, whether it's the local leaders or the state leaders or the federal leaders is economic impact and jobs. It's always the first thing that I'm asked about in a lobbying entity, even though they may have other different interests as well. So while we do research on all of those things to one level or another, we do a lot of deep research on economic impact because of we know the questions are going to come there. And what we've been able to show with this arts and economic prosperity study is, first of all, the footprint of the economic impact is way bigger than anybody thinks. I had mentioned 63.8 billion. That's the collective budgets, 63.8 billion, the collective budgets of the nonprofit arts organizations in America. But if you want to know the impact in a very conservative way, we then asked a second set of questions to audience members. How much do you spend after you spent the money on the arts when you come to a particular locale? How much do you spend on things like meals or transportation or childcare or lodging if you come from out of town? And what we discovered is that that was an additional $102 billion. So that the economic impact is $166.3 billion from nonprofit arts organizations in America. And I can tell you that that gets the attention of any legislator. It is the main and only reason that the Congressional Arts Caucus, the only argument, these figures that the Congressional Arts Caucus uses year after year in going to Congress, the floor of the House, to get the budget passed. The other thing about that is that it creates some 4.6 million jobs. So that's a lot of jobs in our country, 4.6 million. That's bigger than the number of police officers or lawyers or farming and fishing and forestry and other areas as well. That catches people's attention as well. And then other things really are of interest. So, for example, tourism is a really big interest at the local level of governments. And what we've been able to show is that the average person coming to a town, spends $31.47 in addition to what they've spent on the arts on those other areas. So all of the small businesses that surround an arts entity also benefit, and they can get behind, the support of the arts. And then what we also were able to show with this study is that if somebody was coming from out of town, it was another $20 per person being spent because they've got lodging and things like that. So that out-of-town tourism was a big incentive. So we take the data, we parse it into different kinds of packages of arguments like those that I just mentioned, and combined with other data, like we do a public opinion poll every year that shows that, for example, 82% of Americans believe that arts and culture are important to local businesses and the economy. And these then become the arguments for investing in the arts when just love of the arts is not enough.
I was on your website and talked to Randy Cohen, your chief researcher. You've created a COVID calculator tool, which I know some of our member organizations we've sent to them have found really helpful. Can you talk about that and what COVID research you've got up there available?
Yeah. So let me start off by saying that we do these calculators so that people who don't have any money to spend on an economic impact study can do something at least. And the economic impact study that we did has a calculator that goes with it, so that any community or any organization can take it, and relying on all of the different data that's been collected nationally from thousands and thousands of organizations, you're able to put some figures in and pop out an estimate of the economic impact of your entity or your neighborhood or your community. And that's really powerful. We make no bones about the fact that it's an estimate, and it's not as deep as if you did all the work and did all the interviews, but it's there. On the COVID side, we have 4 different studies that are up on our website that anybody can go and take a look at. The first one is on nonprofit arts organizations. And what we have discovered, we've now surveyed over 15,000 organizations. It's a rolling study, so it keeps changing as the pandemic keeps changing. And right now, we know from that study that $14 billion in financial losses have been realized to date by the nonprofit arts organizations. And so we used, there's many other things, that are in there, like 845,000 jobs no longer being supported, and 96% canceled events, 96% canceled events, and so on. And 11% are not confident that they will survive the pandemic. So 11% of the 120,000 organizations going out of business. We use those facts to get, when you add up those things that I had shown you earlier of COVID-19 support, that's over $10 billion, over $10 billion of resources, one way or the other, coming from our federal government to COVID relief for the arts. So the data and the research helped leverage that. And so that is the organizational one. We have another study up there that is called, that is on artists and creative workers. That one has surveyed twice as many as the organizations. And we now know that we're looking at $50.6 billion in lost 2020 revenue, $22,000 per worker. 95% have experienced income loss and 63% have become fully unemployed. So these are artists and creative workers and gig workers. And they need things. They've expressed unemployment insurance, food and housing assistance, forgivable business loans. So with the, and by the way, Black, Indigenous, people of color artists have higher rates of unemployment than white artists, 69% versus 60%. And they expect to lose an even larger percentage of their 2020 income. So those are two of the studies. We have a third study that looks at audiences and the effect on audiences of the loss of arts in their lives on their emotional health, things like mental health, and other areas like that. That is another argument for investment in the arts, public health, period. And then the fourth study looks at, we got the money, where does the money go? Who is actually going after this and getting the money, and can we see any patterns there, particularly in areas where we have to help people? So that's the research, all of which, everything that I've mentioned, you can find on our website for free and download anything that's of use.
And Pauline has actually put the link into the chat box so people can go there directly. So thank you for that. And I certainly can recommend it. We have made mention of this and forwarded this information to a couple of our members who are wrestling with just these issues in terms of understanding the impact of the shutdown on their organizations, on their communities, and in their genres in their communities, and they found it very helpful. We are, I think, just about out of time. Bob, thank you very much for joining us, for sharing your insights, your experience, your recommendations, and we'll check back with you after November 3rd and maybe after January 20th to see what we can expect. But I think the important point that you mentioned is the time for advocacy is always. You don't wait until there's a bill. You don't wait until there's an election, although obviously those are key marking points. Rather, this is work that you need to be doing on an ongoing basis. Every opportunity, whether at the federal, state, or local level, to carry your message to the people who have the ability to have an impact legislatively on in terms of funding, or as you say, tax issues, or so many other issues, immigration issues, or so forth, are as important to arts organizations. So thank you for joining us. You'll see a poll up. If you could take a moment and take the moment to fill that out, we'd appreciate that. As I said at the outset, all of this information is available on our website. You can see recaps and recordings of previous webinars that we've done. And by joining us today, you will receive a copy of our newsletter that will spotlight this and future webinars. So take a moment, please fill out the poll. We thank you all for joining us. To all of you who are working in the world of the arts, I would say stay safe, be well, remain hopeful. Don't forget to vote if you haven't voted already, and make sure that others do the same. We appreciate your joining us and hope that you found this information useful. So Bob, thank you again. Karen, thanks as always for your support, and we'll be in touch. Thank you all.
And thank you. A pleasure.